Hello everybody, Angry Harry here. In this podcast I would just like to talk about the conference that took place in America last weekend and to discuss one aspect of it, and that is whether or not it represents a milestone for the men's movement. But before I address that issue, I would like to state that my own opinion is that the conference was a huge success, and I congratulate Paul Elam for having made it happen. In my view, nearly all the speakers were worth listening to, and I listened to the whole conference from England while it was happening. I enjoyed just about all of it, and what heartened me, perhaps more than anything else, was the view clearly expressed by a number of speakers, perhaps most vividly by Erin Pitsey, that feminism is an evil empire. More than anything else in the conference was the unanimity among the speakers, pretty much, in pointing at feminism and blaming it for many of the ills that our societies in the West are currently having to deal with. But we have had conferences before. This isn't the first men's conference to take place. Indeed, some 15 years ago in London, a conference organised by the United Kingdom men's movement took place, and it was very good. And Robert Whiston, who was recently on the Erin Pitsey show here at AVFM, was one of the main speakers and organisers of this conference. And it was a very good conference indeed. It was well attended, and the speakers were excellent. One of them that I remember was Professor Stephen Baskerville, an American professor at Patrick Henry College in Washington, D.C., spoke at great length about the burgeoning divorce industry. And he described in great detail how it was that this multi-billion-dollar industry was using its muscle to create more divorce and more disharmony among men and women. Not only that, lawyers were funding women's groups in much the same way that corporations and businesses advertise products. Lawyers were handing out money, and probably still do, to women's groups so that they would have the wherewithal and the finances to make a huge fuss about just about everything that they could. The idea being to promote the view that women were being abused all over the place and in every circumstance, and that women should take legal redress, with lawyers also touting for business directly and pointing out to women that they had a great deal to gain, financially and otherwise, if they accused their partners of abuse. Other speakers at the conference in London 15 years ago addressed other issues, but I don't recall any of them pointing a finger at feminism. It might have happened, but I can't remember it. But this conference in 2014, clearly many of the speakers did point the finger at feminism, and I concur with that view. But the question of whether this conference was a milestone for the men's movement is something that troubles me, because I don't think it is. The conference that I attended in London 15 years ago didn't bring about much change. And I believe that the National Coalition of Free Men had a conference on men's issues in the 1970s. But it wasn't a turning point. Indeed, if we look at groups like Fathers for Justice, a highly visible campaigning group, indeed, according to one media research organization, the most successful activist group in the past 100 years, not in terms of what they have achieved, but in terms of how much publicity they have generated for themselves, we can surely see that publicity alone, no matter how good, is not enough. Because Fathers for Justice hasn't, to my knowledge, achieved very much. Furthermore, as readers of AVFM will already know, there have been many activist groups in the past 100 years trying to change the situation, the poor situation, in which many men have found themselves as a result of feminist-inspired laws. What we can learn from all of this seems to me very clear. That talking about the issues, publicizing the issues, is just not enough. And with regard to the recent International Men's Conference of 2014, exactly the same is likely to happen in my view. That is to say, it's come, and very soon it will be gone, and perhaps even within a month or two, it will disappear from view. Unless, that is, MRAs do not allow this to happen. And so I now come to the point of this podcast, which is to point out what might well be obvious to many of you, and that is that for this conference to represent a milestone in the men's movement, MRAs need to keep referring to it. Now, Paul Elam and the AVFM crew cannot spend much more of their time going over and over again what happened and what was said at the conference, because AVFM has to keep pulling in the readers. And if it keeps going on about the conference, all its readers will get bored and they'll go elsewhere. It's one of the problems of running a website where you want to discuss issues, that you have to keep coming up with new stuff, often new material, in order to keep people interested in your website. If you don't do that, you lose your audience. So it isn't possible really for Paul and Dean and the rest of the crew to keep going on about the conference. though of course some things can be done with regard to making it easy for newcomers to access the conference videos by perhaps putting a strong link somewhere on the front page. But I think that there is a very easy way for us to ensure that this conference does represent a milestone. And I don't think I'm suggesting anything that others will not have thought of, but I do want to expressly put it down in this podcast to make it clear what I think needs to be done. And there are two things. Firstly, there needs to be a page on AVFM entitled something like "Are MRAs misogynist?" or "Are AVFM supporters misogynist?" or misogynistic. And at the top of this page, the first 2 or 3 paragraphs should state very clearly who was speaking at the conference. So it would go something like this. If AVFM supporters are misogynistic, then why did the following people support AVFM by coming to the conference and speaking in support of AVFM? Aaron Pitsey, the very founder of the refuge centres for battered women in the United Kingdom, Senator Ann Cools, the first black female senator in North America, Dr. Warren, on and on it goes. The point being that anyone landing on this page can see within 20 seconds, 30 seconds, that it is just not credible that the MRAs who support AVFM are misogynistic. And 5 videos perhaps below those paragraphs of the best speakers at the conference, and by best I mean those whose speeches support best AVFM's agenda. So that's item number 1, in my view, when it comes to trying to keep the conference alive and to help make it into a turning point, a milestone. But number 2, my point number 2, which is just coming up, is also very important. And for me, as an active activist, I believe this is the most important aspect of the conference. It is the most valuable aspect of it. And this involves MRAs themselves. They need to copy the link to the page that I have just described and to keep it somewhere that is readily accessible on their computers. And then, wherever they might be on the internet, having the usual fights with feminists and posting their comments on various forums hither and thither, should they at any point be accused of being misogynists, they can simply counter it with one sentence. If MRAs are misogynistic, why did these people come to our conference to support us? And then the link. That's all MRAs would need to do. Instead of getting involved in a fight over whether MRAs are misogynistic or not, and whether feminists are misandric or not, all they have to do is to say, if we're misogynistic, why did these people speak at our conference? Link. Or why did these important people of high status, who clearly are in support of women's rights, why did they speak at our conference? Link. By doing that, the conference can be kept alive. And there are so many instances that MRAs come across wherein they are accused of being misogynists, that they will be able to use the link to the aforementioned page on numerous occasions. And this will bring a great deal of traffic to AVFM, and it will also quickly disabuse people of the notion that they can continue to get away with calling MRAs misogynistic. So, to summarize my podcast, I would say this. The International Men's Conference of 2014 can be made into a milestone, into a turning point, by doing two things. Having a web page, which very briefly describes who the conference speakers are, followed by perhaps 4 or 5 videos below of the best ones with regard to supporting AVFM, and 2, MRAs making that link quickly available to themselves on their own computers so that they can slosh it down whenever they're accused of being misogynistic. Which, let's face it, is just about all the time. And that, my dear friends, is the end of Angry Harry's first podcast. Thank you for listening.